Good morning, welcome to Meets Rod Shop. I'm Jason. Today we're going to be working on my 1971 Dodge Dart Swinger. Not actually the car, but the engine that's going to be going into it. So what I have here is a 1995 360 Magnum. It's a stock block, stock bore. It's been dingle ball honed. It's been balanced, so I've had the crank turned and had balance put on the crank. We are going to be running just some cheap standard bore Keith Black flat top hyper-eutectic pistons. We are putting a decent cam in from Oregon Cam Grinding, and we're just going to be a general somewhat performance build, stock heads, like I said, stock stroke, stock bore. But let's go ahead, we'll get started. All right, first thing you want to do when you're starting any type of builds, make sure your block's nice and clean. I've added this here at home, so I hot tanked it for about 24 hours, cleaned out all the sludge, sprayed everything down, painted the block, put new freeze plugs in. I am going to be running ARP main studs on this. We are going to be running ARP head bolts as well. I like to use studs whenever possible, but it's impossible to find the head studs for a Magnum engine, but they did have the main studs. So we'll go ahead, we'll get these caps off, we'll clean them up again, then we'll go ahead and put the bearings in there, and I'll show you how to put the bearings in and how to check the gaps and everything else using plastic gauge. I've got a dial bore gauge. I just find that plastic gauge is quick, it's simple, it works. I haven't had an issue using it yet, and to be honest with you, most people in shops don't have access to dial bore gauges, so for this point we'll just be using plastic gauge. All right, let's talk about one issue with main studs on these Dodge, 5.2, 5.9, 318, 360 Magnums. When you're running main studs on these things, they interfere with the oil pump. I'll have to bring you in a little bit closer. I'll show you what I'm talking about. But when you put your main cap on, the driver's side bolt will actually contact the oil pump and not allow you to bolt it down all the way. So what you need to do is you trim the stud down. Some people run that nut there without a washer. I'm not a fan of doing that. But what the easy fix is to get a 12-point nut versus a standard 6-point nut. ARP should send you one if you call them and tell them what you're doing and tell them it's not working. I think they'll send one to you. I don't know if they charge or not, but that's what I've got to do. I've got to call and get one sent, but I've already trimmed my main stud. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to install it, torque it down as normal, and then come back later and I'll back off both of these nuts, and then I'll put the 12-point nut on and retorque just that last main. Another thing you want to look for, Mopar uses this 2-piece seal on this engine, so it goes down in a chamfer in the block. You cannot change this rear main seal without pulling the main cap. Kind of a pain in the butt. I don't know why they did that, but I guess that's just how some manufacturers do it. Another thing to remind you, when you're putting in your rear main seal, and I'll bring you in closer, you want to make sure that the biggest lip is facing the front of the engine, and what that does is when the oil pressure builds up, that will actually make that seal balloon out and tighten around the crankshaft a little bit tighter. So always put your rear main seal with the lip facing the front of the engine or the inside of the engine. So I'll bring you in here real quick and I'll show you how that main stud on the driver's side contacts the oil pump when you put it in. All right, so when you're installing that oil pump, you can see, get down close here, you can see where it's hitting and not allowing the pump to sit flush. You can see probably better from this side angle here, so you can really see where it's hammering on that nut there. So what you'll do is, they say the 12-point nut will let it clear better. Don't do what I did. I went and I said, man, I'll mill some of the oil pump away, you know. So I did. Clearance the oil pump and clearance right inside to the inside of the oil pump. So don't do what I did. Don't clearance the oil pump, because now I've got a lead weight here, so I'm just going to go buy me a new oil pump. I mean, they're cheap enough, but don't do what I did. Another thing is here's that rear main seal I was talking about. You can see how you got the small lip here and you get the big lip here. Make sure that bigger lip is installed to the front of the engine when you put these in on both the main cap and in the chamfer area. So you can see here's the chamfer that the rear main seal rides in. You can see I've already got the lower seal in, so I'll just go ahead and pop that down in there. It's hard to do it left-handed. Just push it on down in there and make sure it's sealed in there good, pops in there good, you know. Make sure it's level. So I'll probably have to take that one back out and move it around a little bit, but I'll do that off camera. All right, as you can see here, I've got all the main studs that are in. You're not cramming these things down and locking them down into the block. You're just putting them in finger tight, you know, as tight as you can get them. So in here, you can see the oiling holes for each main. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see they're cleaned up. And you see these little cutouts in the block here. I don't know if you can see it. Lighting's not that good, but you can probably see it better on this one here. There is a little notch for the bearing. When you put the bearing in, there'll be a little kick out for it, and that's where that locks in there. The caps have the same thing. So I'll show you. This one is number 1 main cap, so that's right here. If you look, it's got that same kick out. So you want to make sure when you line your tabs up for the bearings, you want to make sure when you line your tabs up for the bearings that you line them up properly. And if you look, that main cap will only go on one way. If you try and turn it, so it's marked 1, so this is a number 1. So you turn it and watch. It won't fit in the block. See, there's a gap here. It's overlapping there. So you know which way your main caps are supposed to go. So let's go ahead and we're going to pop these bearings in real quick. All right, I need to add another thing as well. If you notice this main cap, you've got an oiling hole in the bearing. This is a number 3 thrust bearing. So this thrust plate surface here on this bearing, you see how it's got sides on it? That sets your thrust bearing clearance. So what that does is that sets your forward and aft movement on your crank. So, but you see there's a hole in that crank. You got to make sure that that oiling hole lines up in your bearing. So again, this is the number 3 thrust bearing. So you see how I got the tab on backwards? It's because I wasn't thinking. But all right, so you see there's that little tab in the bearing that I was just telling you about, and that's got to coincide with this tab here. So you just pop them in. Well, it's hard to do while holding the camera and being right-handed trying to do something left-handed. So then you pop it in place, make sure it's flush. I got to knock this down a little bit, and then you can see that that hole lines up with that. Your main cap does not have that hole. So the standard size, or the standard side, the standard bearing, excuse me, the standard bearing, you notice for the main cap, this will sit up here, and there will be no hole in the cap. All right, as you can see, I've put all of the, it's the top half, but right now it's the bottom because the engine's flipped over. But I've got the top half of the bearings with the correct tabs in place, with the oiling holes lined up in place. So now what you're going to do is you're going to take your crank very gently. After you wipe out your bearings, wipe your crank off, and we're going to set that in place. I guess just a little bit more about this build. Like I said, this is a very mild performance build, other than it's got a decent sized cam, and it's got a flat top, set of flat top pistons going in there. Other than that, it's not a real crazy build. You know, I don't have aftermarket heads. The cam's not monstrous. I didn't bump up the compression a whole lot. But this crank is just a standard. I got it from O'Reilly's. I think you can get them from all of the major box stores. This is a remanufactured crank. I think it's 30 over. That means they've cut 30 thousandths out of the mains. I think the rods are either 10 or 20 thousandths out of the rods. So what the reason I'm putting that crank kit in it is I bought a whole truck. I bought a 95 Dodge Ram for $500 at an auction that had this 360 in it, and it had a nasty rod knock. So I didn't even attempt to get that crank turned. I chucked it when I scrapped the rest of the truck. So I pulled the engine out, all the accessories, transmission, and kept the engine and the accessories. So when I chucked that crank, I just went ahead and ordered this. I think it was $250 for the crank. It's already turned. It comes with main and rod bearings. I did take it in and have it balanced. Of course, I had new pistons pressed on the rods. I had the rods resized. I had ARP rod bolts installed. So it'll be a good solid build. You know, nothing real fast for the car, but it's a 71 Dodge Dart, so it'll be a little bit of fun. It's got a TKO 500 going behind it, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, so I've got the crank out. It's sitting here. I've inspected it. I inspected it before I took it to the machine shop to have it balanced anyway, because once you start grinding and cutting and adding Mallory to these crankshafts, you can't take them back. Once you start messing with them, the parts store says, hey, you should have checked your clearances before you had all that done. What I do is I have the machine shop check the clearances, and they mic it all out and tell me, at least what the size is, what it's 30 thousandths over or whatever it may be. But I've got the bearings in. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna pick up the crank. I have not put any lubrication on the bearings because we're just gonna be putting the caps in. I'm gonna be checking clearances. Then the crank will come back out and I'll lube the crank up, and then we'll go from there. As I said, very gently pick the crank up and slowly lower it down. You don't want to slam it down onto the bearings. The that's it. Once you set it in place, like I said, I gotta lube the rear main as well. You never want to put these rear mains in dry because you'll burn them up when you first start them up. So, but the crank's in. She seems to spin decently. So, of course, we haven't put the main caps down yet. But now we're going to go ahead. We're going to put the main caps on, and we're going to check the clearance using plastic gauge. So here's what that plastic gauge is. You can see it just looks like a little spaghetti noodle, and you'll just cut a chunk of it off of there. Then you'll take it and you'll place it on the main cap, or not on the main cap, but on the main journal. Like here's the rear main. Then you got your number 4 main, number 3 main, 2, and number 1. So you'll just take a piece and you'll place it right here. You'll put the cap on there, and then you'll torque it down, and then you'll measure basically how much does it squish that plastic down. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, as you can see right there, I've got the plastic gauge sitting on there. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take my number 3 bearing with my bearing installed. I'm going to place it on, go ahead and place it on the main studs, slowly lower it down on there, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to torque these to spec. And I got to look up the specs on them. I want to say it's 85 foot-pounds, but don't quote me on that. I'll tell you here in a second. All right, when you're getting ready to torque on your ARP studs or Mylodon studs, or wherever you want to, any bolt you're tightening when it comes to rod bolts, head bolts, and main studs, you want to use some ARP thread Ultra Torque thread assembler, lube, whatever you want to call it. What this does is make sure that you get a uniform torque on this. So I just put a little bit on the washer, a little bit on the stud, and then I go ahead and I torque my nuts down. That's what she said. All right, so I know I said ARP, but these main studs are actually Mylodon. So according to Mylodon's website, it's a 1/2 inch stud, therefore it goes to 85 foot-pounds. What I like to do is I do it in 2 torques, so I'll torque it to 40 and then I'll bring it up to 85. Remember, when you're torquing, you don't want to stop and start, stop and start. You want one smooth torquing motion until it clicks. That way, you know, you're not overcoming the pressure of the nut on the stud or anything, and it's gonna not quite be at the correct torque. So remember, you want one smooth torque. So I'll torque these down a little bit just to get the main caps seated. You'll do both. All right, now we'll go ahead and we'll go to 45 foot-pounds is what I'm going to. Now I'll go ahead and I'll bump it all the way up to the 85. Remember, one smooth motion. All right, now it's torqued. You'll go ahead and back it off, pull the main cap, and we'll see how far down that bearing smashed, or excuse me, how far the plastic gauge is smashed down. All right, now that the main cap studs are loosened, the nuts are off, you can go ahead and get a soft mallet and tap the main cap. All right, now that we've got the main cap off here, you bring it in close and you can see how far down that plastic got smashed, so we'll go ahead and measure it. All right, so you take the plastic gauge outer cover, it has a little gauge reading on there, and you'll measure it, and it comes out on this one, looks about 2 thousandths clearance, which is perfect for this engine. I don't want too much, and I obviously don't want not enough either, too. That'll hurt you more. So then what I'll do is I'll just take a wooden handle, the other end of a steel brush, and I just scrape it off there. Some people say you don't have to scrape it off. You know, I do. And now she's clean. I'll spray it down with some brake cleaner, and then we'll go ahead and we'll go do the other ones. I'm not going to run you through all of them. Once you do one, I think you'll kind of know what you're doing. And I'll give you one other tip too. I usually buy a case of brake cleaner whenever I'm building an engine. I use a lot of it just to spray everything down, clean it up, you know. So take a little bit of brake cleaner, a lintless rag, wipe off the cap one more time, wipe off the bearing and the crank. You're good to go. One other tip, and this is just a personal tip, and actually if you watch it, I broke it, the very first main cap I did. In my opinion, torque wrenches are made for one thing and one thing only, and that's torquing bolts, not untorquing bolts. Now, if you watch, I went ahead and I backed off that first main cap with my torque wrench, and that's, in my world, that's a no-no. So what I did is I went and got my other ratchet set up with a 3/4 inch socket on there so I can knock these loose. But some people say it's not a big deal. Just in my mechanical military aircraft background, you never used a torque wrench to back off a nut. All right, we've torqued all the main caps down. We've checked all the clearances with plastic gauge. Everything's within spec. So now I've got the main caps back off. I'll retighten all the main studs by hand, and then I'll pull the crank, and then we're gonna lube all the top half of the bearings. And a lot of people tell me, well, not a lot of people. Some people tell me that bearing pre-lube, you know, engine assembly lube is, oh, it's not needed. As long as you prime your oil pump, you're good. And that may be well and true. But for the $17 that I buy the pre-assembly lube, and it lasts me for several engines, why wouldn't I put it in there? You know, $17 and you end up taking a risk of smoking a bearing and tearing up your brand new build. I think I'll spend the $17 and get the pre-assembly lube. Again, you may use it, you may not, that's on you. But I know I use it on every build I do, and I've never had a problem with bearings. So there's that. All right, let's get this crank out of here. All right, the crank's out. I've got the main studs all hand torqued back in here again. You may want to make one more inspection of the crank if you want to. I've already looked at this thing several times. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put some pre-assembly lube on each of the top half of the bearings that's in the engine. And then we'll go ahead and we'll drop the crank back in. All right, what I use for assembly lube is I'm using this Lucas High Performance Assembly Lube. And the reason why is because that's what the parts store had. You can use Lubriplate 105. A lot of people use Lubriplate 105. I've used that before. That's good stuff as well. But this is what I have on hand, so this is what I'm going to use. Just go ahead and put a good liberal coat on the bearings. All right. Once you got the assembly lube in there, go ahead and put the crank back in. Remember, don't drop it. You want to place it gently. All right, so the crank's back in. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna lube the main caps on the back main. Since this seal is split halfway, you can offset the seal a little bit. You can put a little dab of grease, or not grease, but sealer on the ends. That way it mates together and squeezes and does that. Whatever floats your boat. I know a lot of people offset that seal a little bit. I don't. I just run a little bit of sealer between the main caps, just a dab. You don't want it squirting out all over the place, but that's how I do it. It's up to you. One other thing, don't forget to lube the rear main seal, the half that's in the block, like I just forgot. So I gotta pull the crank back out and we'll lube that rear main seal real quick. All right, so I got that little dab of sealer on the ends of my rear main cap seal. I've put some VVP or some Vaseline on the rear main seal. I'll just go ahead and start placing the caps on there. Remember, your main caps are numbered 1 through 5, 1 being the front. All right, now that the crank's in, I got the main cap sitting back down on there. I'm gonna go ahead and run my washers. I'm gonna load up the main studs with the torquing lube for torquing them down. And then we'll go ahead and we'll torque these again. All right, all the main caps are on. I've got the nuts run down, everything's lubed. I'm gonna start on the number 3 bearing. I'm gonna torque it to 40 to 45 foot-pounds, and I'm gonna move outwards from there. All right, so they're all at 40 pounds. We're gonna go ahead and bump it up to 85 now. All right, so they're all torqued to 40, or 85 foot-pounds, excuse me. Now we'll go ahead and make sure that the crank still turns. And it does. You can see I can turn it by hand, so that'll let you know that it's good. All right, now we're on to fitting pistons. All right, what we're using for this build is the Keith Black 107 style pistons. This is a standard bore piston. It's just a hyper-eutectic. They can't take a whole lot of boost. They can't take a whole lot of nitrous. I will tell you, I am gapping the rings for nitrous in this application. Will I ever use it? No telling. I'd like to. I don't have any nitrous cars, but I wouldn't mind shooting a 150, 175 shot on this car, just to see, how it works out. But so these are stock rods, have been resized. They got ARP rod bolts, and like I said, the Keith Black 107 piston installed. All right, so on these Keith Black pistons, what I'm going to be running is just a standard Hastings plasma moly ring. I did already gap the rings, but I'll show you the process anyway. So what you do is you'll take your oil scraper, second ring, you'll take your top ring, and you'll place them in the bore. So like right here, this is the top ring for the number 1 cylinder. So you'll come over to the number 1 cylinder, you'll take the ring, you'll place it in the bore gently. You don't want to snap them in there, Then what I do is I just take my piston, stick it upside down, shove it down in the hole about halfway, halfway is good. And then you'll take your feeler gauge and what you're doing is you're measuring your end gap. So you see you got a gap on the ring here, so it's going to squeeze together in the cylinder wall. And you'll pick your correct feeler gauge and make sure that your feeler gauge will fit between that end gap. You have to know what end gap you need to run. You just can't throw rings in there, especially on hyper-eutectic pistons. You'll snap a ring land in a heartbeat. So because this is a naturally aspirated street engine and I'm planning on running nitrous, I'm going to gap my top and second ring to 32 thousandths. So I've got my feeler gauge, stick it up in there, and slides right in. If the gap was too small, which all of my gaps were too small, you'll stick it on a piston ring filer, and then you'll file them down to make sure you got the correct end gap. So this is my piston ring filer. I've had it for years. It's just a cheap Summit brand one, and I've mounted it to a chunk of 2x4 so I can hold it in my vise. Then you just stick your ring on here against the wheel, press in on it, crank it a few times. Like you don't want to do too many. You don't want to open the ring gap too much because you can't add material too, but you could take away. And this, just by hand cranking, I think the second ring, about 20 cranks, 19 to 20 cranks, gave me enough ring gap. I had to do about 30 on the top rings, but so just crank away on this thing. It'll file up your ring gap, and then you'll take some emery cloth or you'll take a jeweler's file and you'll file the edges on this because it will create a high spot on the ring gap. So you don't want that digging into your cylinder walls. So you'll file that off and then you'll go ahead and stick them on your pistons and throw them in the hole. Now these are Since this engine's been balanced, these are hole specific. They are marked, like this one's number 2. A lot of times when your engine comes apart, when you have them balanced, if you didn't mark it before you took it apart, your engine builder will mark the rod end and the main rod, you know, what cylinder number it goes into. And it's hard to tell, but there's a chamfer on the inside of your rod. That chamfer always goes against the flat spot of the crank. And the non-chamfered side will go against where the other rod in a V8 configuration will, they share the same rod journal on the crank, so you want the flat sides facing each other. So on here I've got my valve reliefs, you can see, so that's going to go up. So that's the number 2, which would be on a small block Mopar. It's the driver side forward, no, passenger side forward, excuse me. It's on the, yeah, passenger side forward hole is a number 2 piston. So this piston being marked number 2 would go right here. One thing I do as well, I'll show you here. One thing I'll do as well, when I'm filing my rings, I'll just take a piece of butcher's paper and I'll mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that way I know which rings go where. Don't get your top ring and your second ring mixed up either. On this one, the second ring is actually marked, whereas the top ring is not, so it's pretty easy to tell the difference. So in here you can see the ring is in place, so there's the end gap there. So I'll take the feeler gauge and I'll stick it right in there, and sure enough, right at 32 thousandths, I've got just the right end gap on there. So that's how you check your end gap. All right, so when you're putting your pistons together for your rings, you'll start out with your oil control ring. That goes in the bottom groove. You just go ahead, put them on there, snap that on there first, so that you'll see that it's the wavy ring. That's your oil control groove. You always put that on first. Then you've got the 2 real thin rings. One goes on the bottom, one goes on the top, and just walk them in. Be careful you don't scratch the piston while doing this. Don't force it, take your time, just kind of work it around. And it'll snap right on in there. Now that first one went on the bottom of the bottom, I guess is what you want to call it, the bottom of that oil control ring. Then this one will go on top. And the reason you have to put them in after you put that oil control in there is because that oil control on the back of the ring, on the inside of the ring, there's these little tabs that those top rings help keep in control. So if you try to put that on, put the 2 rings on first, now you're trying to get it over the small rings, it's not going to go in there. It won't work that way. So now what I'm looking for is, I got my second ring, and there's a dot on this one, so the dot goes up according to the directions. So you just place it in that second ring land, you just walk it around. It's pretty self-explanatory. And again, try not to scratch your piston. Then the top ring on this set, the top ring here is not beveled at all. There's no markings, so at that point it doesn't matter which way it goes. You want to put, so on here you try to put your ring end gaps, so your oil control ring you want like down, you want your second ring in like the 10 o'clock position, and you want your top ring in like the 2 o'clock position. That way they're not lined up with each other. Ultimately, as soon as you start the engine, they're going to move around anyway, but just for initial startup. There you go. So now I got all the rings on the pistons. This piston's ready to install. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do the rest of the rings off camera, and then we'll stick them in the hole. All right, now that we have the crank fully installed, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna start stuffing pistons in the holes. What I ended up doing to solve my oil pump problem, if you remember at the beginning of the video, I was telling you there was an issue with the, what would be the driver's side number 5 main cap bolt, is the oil pump will hit these ARP studs. Unfortunately, what I ended up having to do was pull the stud out and go back in with a regular 1/2 inch by 13 thread ARP bolt. I had to take the washer out from underneath it, which I'm not happy about doing that, and then run the bolt down, torque it to spec, and then I just took the old knuckle buster flat disc and kind of knocked just a hair off of the corner of one of the points on the bolt, and the oil pump now clears it. So that's my suggestion for getting your studs to fix. I'm not a big fan of running one stud and one bolt in the main cap, but we're going to do it just because. So let's go ahead. We're going to start. We'll do the driver side front piston on this Mopar, which should be, I believe it's the number 1, maybe the number 2. I think it's number 1. We'll take a look at that though. Let me pull up the old Google machine and we'll find out if it is a number 1 or number 2. All right, let's go ahead and start. And instead of doing the number 1 cylinder, which is the driver side front, we're going to start with a number 2 cylinder because it's facing the camera on the passenger side front. So you'll go to your pistons. You'll grab which one's marked as number 2. That's number 7. That ain't going to work. Number 2. 4, 8, 2. All right, so I got number 2. As before, we've already got the piston rings are already installed. Make sure they're clocked properly. Verify it is a number 2. Get your main caps apart here. They can be kind of a pain to undo if you don't have a cap, rod cap tool. I don't. You'd think I would with all the engines I build, but I don't. So go ahead and take the main cap off. Set them someplace safe where you won't lose them. And then you'll go ahead and you'll get your bearing set, which I happen to be using King bearings for this. Why? Because that's what came with the Crankmaster kit. I am a fan of the King bearings, and if I'm correct, I think these are 10 thousandths over. These are 10 thousandths over size. So that means that my main caps, excuse me, the rod journal on the crank has been turned 10 thousandths over. So and on these rod bearings, there are no grooves, so it doesn't matter if it's top or bottom. As with the main caps on this, there is a little kick out in the rod, so just go ahead, make sure, and the little indentation in the rod bearing goes into that indentation in the rod cap. Put a piece of rubber or some plastic over your rod bolts so that you don't scratch the cylinder wall. I will go get some. So I've got my rubber hose over the rod bolts. I got my rod bearing installed. So now I will go ahead and use my ring compressor. You'll slide the piston in here. Now this one is an adjustable tapered. I've never used this one before. I'm not really a big fan of them, but on short moments notice, this is all I could find. You'll go ahead and you want to turn your crank so that the rod journal's on the bottom to where it'll go in farther. Go ahead, slide your piston set up in there. Take the the wooden handle on your hammer. You could use a piston tool like I'm using. You don't want to get crazy with them, but just go ahead and drive them on in like that. Then what I'll do is I'll make sure, go underneath here, guide the rod in place. Just go ahead and tap her on down. Before she gets all the way down, you want to make sure that your rod bearing didn't twist, so go ahead and flip your engine over and take a look at it. As you can see there, here comes the big end of the rod coming out. The bearing looks good, so just go ahead and tap her on in there. She's in. Take your rubber protector off, and again, we're going to be using the plastic gauge, so we're going to put a green piece of plastic gauge right over this rod journal here, and then we'll go ahead and torque it down and we'll see how it squeezes out. Squeeze out, oh yeah. So take your rod cap, take the other half of your rod bearing, make sure it's placed in there properly. And what they'll do when they take these apart, you always want to make sure that the chamfer's on the correct side. So like here is the counterweight, you'll see it here. You want the beveled edge of the rod cap and the main rod to go against that counterweight. You want the non-beveled edge of the rod cap and main rod to go against what would be the number 1 cylinder in this case, but the opposite cylinder that shares this rod journal. You want those to be together. So the beveled edge against the counterweight, and then obviously the other piston, it's going to be on the other side. So go ahead, place it there. What you'll do, take some ARP assembly lube. Ooh, that's a lot. That's a lot. Do a little dab on the bolt there. Start your nuts. Booyah. And then you'll go ahead and torque them down to the proper spec. I'll tell you what the proper spec for these ARP rod bolts are here in 1 second when I look. All right. So for the Chrysler 318 to 360 wedge and Magnum rod bolts, it says they want us to stretch the bolts instead of torquing the bolts. I don't feel like doing that, so it says it's got another method, which is 50 foot-pounds using ARP Ultra Torque Fastener Assembly Loop, which I did do. So we're going to go ahead and torque these up to 50 foot-pounds. It's a 9/16 nut on this. We'll just go ahead and we'll run them down by hand, just snug, and then we'll go ahead and torque them up to, like I said, 50 foot-pounds. You can do 25, which I think that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and we'll torque it to 25, and then torque them on up to 50 after that. So remember, one smooth pull. Go ahead and break them loose. Take the back side of your hammer or whatever and knock them loose. If you can. So you'll go ahead and check out the squeeze on there. This looks to be pretty good. This is, yep, 100 thousandths. So that should be right where we need it. Go ahead and clean up that crank, clean it all off, and we'll be good to go. All right, so our rod journal clearance is about 150 thousandths, which is tight, but it's good enough. We're gonna go ahead and we'll put some assembly lube back on this journal here. I guess you gotta open the bottle first. But we'll go ahead and put some assembly lube on here, and we'll go ahead and tighten it down. Again, remember, the chamfered side of the rod goes against the counterweight. Another way to do it, if your machine shop did it right, you can't always trust them, is they'll normally mark one side of the rod, both the cap and the rod, the number. So this is mark number 2. You want to make sure the numbers are right next to each other, right on the same side of the rod, which these are, but I already verified that the chamfer's on the correct side, so that's not really a big deal. Go ahead and tap that rod cap down. Go ahead and torque it up. Again, we're going with 50 foot-pounds, and that's using ARP assembly lube. So let's back this back down to 25. Then back up to 50. It would be a good thing to make sure this thing spins when you're done and that there's not a whole lot of player slop, which there isn't. I'm not going to walk you through the rest of these. They're all the same, so we'll just go ahead and we'll knock them all out off camera. All right, now that we have all the pistons installed and torqued down, we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the camshaft. This is a custom camshaft. It's grind number 1487 from Oregon Cam Grinding. I highly suggest you call Ken and talk to him. He's out, like I said, Oregon Cam Grinding. So this, it's 110 degrees lobe separation. It's 550 lift on intake and 573 lift on exhaust. It's a little big for a stock Magnum. Do not run this cam with stock Magnum heads unless you have modified them. I am running stock Magnum heads, but I put the Hughes Performance, I believe it's Hughes Performance spring kit on there, so I can get up to like 600 lift before the springs start to bind. So This should wake this 360 up pretty good. But like I said, thanks to Ken at Oregon Cam Grinding, they're not sponsoring me. I get no money other than my wife's money to help me do the stuff I like to do here. So I have no sponsors, but I highly suggest calling Oregon Camshaft Grinding, not just for your Mopars, but for anything. Ken's great, he's knowledgeable, he's been in the business for years. Give him a call, talk to him, tell him your combo, transmission, stall, what you plan on using the car for, and he'll build you a cam for the same price as the majors will, but it'll be a custom build for you. So let's go ahead and get this camshaft installed. I always put a lot of assembly lube on these, especially on the speedometer gear, you know, all the bearing surfaces, all the camshaft lobes, you know, and as they say, less is more, more is less, whatever it is they say. I use as much lube on these as I can. Go ahead and lube them up pretty good, you know. And just be careful. You don't want to nick a lobe, or excuse me, a cam bearing while sliding this in there. So just take your time. Be gentle. Don't just hammer it home. This isn't prom. Why isn't it going in? There we go. She's a little tight. So that's it. So she's in. Now we're going to go ahead and we'll put on the timing set now. All right, now that we have the camshaft in, we're going to go ahead and we'll put the camshaft thrust plate in, and then we'll bolt that down, put the timing sprocket on here. One thing I want to show you is there is some nuances with this type thrust plate. This thrust plate, if you notice, there's only 3 bolt holes in there, but yet it shows 4 on the camshaft thrust plate. The reason why is the 3rd hole in your camshaft thrust plate is for what they call the drip plate. So the oil will come out and drip down onto that plate and then drop the oil down onto your crankshaft sprocket for your timing chain. So let's go ahead and we'll get that installed. For those of you that don't know, here's the camshaft thrust plate, and then here's that drip plate that they put on there. So the bolt hole will go through the bottom left when you're looking at it, bottom right of the actual engine, and then this little tang will go into this 4th hole here. So you just go ahead and bolt that on. One thing I want to make sure and show you, you can see the thrust plate's got some drip lines in here. Go ahead and this goes towards your camshaft. These 3 bolts in front of your camshaft thrust plate are 1/2 inch. Just go ahead and use the old arm torque meter / Newton meter. You should feel it click. Click. See? Audible click. You're not smoking them down, but you're making sure that they're German torque, you know, good and tight. Go back around, make sure they're snug. All right, we're good. So that's how the configuration looks. I'll try and put a picture here somewhere in this area maybe. Yeah, probably in this area. All right, now that we have the camshaft thrust plate on there and the drip tab, let's go ahead and put in the timing sprocket. Normal rules apply. You're going to have a dot on one of your teeth here. The dots from the upper sprocket and lower sprocket should be touching each other, kind of like the flying spaghetti monster. But go ahead and put that on there. Should just slip right on. It does. Then you want to turn your dot down towards your crankshaft pulley. You got your chain. Let's go ahead and before I get too far into it, let's make sure which one's straight up. All right, and on this one, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to use the, I guess the 0 hole? Yeah, let's try the 0 hole. We'll see what that does. All right, once you got it turned to where you want, you're going to go ahead and line the dots up. Dot on the camshaft pulley and dot on the crankshaft pulley. Ooh, not quite. Let's go ahead and move the crank a little bit more. Just a hair. Where's that Swedish nut lathe? Oh, there we go. Not a big fan of that. Let's go ahead and move some stuff around then. What son of a gun, is that thing bottoming out? No, it can't. Son of a, it is bottoming out. Well, looks like we're washing, running different washers in. Hey, Camelot. All right, go ahead, put the, like I said, put the sprocket on. We got the dots, they're pointing at each other. Camshaft is straight up. We did not increase or decrease by 4 degrees or any type of retard or advance on the camshaft. We just put it in straight up. So it's tightened down. We got the cam sprocket on. We got the crankshaft sprocket on there. We're ready to go ahead, I guess, and put the lifters in, put the lifter valley spider down, and then put the oil pump and oil pan on. Excuse me. All right, now that the lifters have been sitting for quite some time, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drop them in the hole. Make sure the little wheel on the bottom is going with the cam, not against it. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad day. And I'll show you what I mean, how the rollers go on this. I'll snap a picture of them, put it up here. You want the wheel to roll along with the cam, not sideways against it. It creates a lot of pressure that way. It will eat up your cam and destroy your brand new engine. I know they've been having a lot of trouble lately with the Chinesium lifters, so I did the right thing and bought Chinesium lifters because that's the only thing they had in stock. The only good thing is this is a roller cam, so this has a roller on the bottom, like a little roller skate wheel kind of is what it looks like. And that rolls along the cam, creates less friction, and frees up horsepower. But these, they haven't really been having that much trouble with. It's mostly the flat tappet cams. Good thing this was always a roller motor anyway, but yeah, I know a lot of guys are having trouble with the flat tappet lifters right now coming out of China. Heat treating is a major thing when it comes to engine building, or parts I should say. Make sure the hardness is the correct tolerance for the engine part. Okay, here's that wheel I was talking about right there. You see it? So you want to make sure that wheel is rolling with the camshaft. So this drops right in the lifter bore there, like that. And then here's the camshaft lobe you can see here. So you want to make sure that that wheel is turning with the camshaft. And then as that turns, these lifters push up and down in their bores. That's what moves the push rod, which in turn opens the valves. All right, now that we have the camshaft in, we have all of the lifters in. We're going to go ahead and put the dog bones down over the lifters. What these do is these keep the lifters square to the camshaft lobe so that the wheels don't turn and burn up, create friction, and toast your motor. I'll go ahead and snap a picture for you and put you on there so you can see the orientation of them. All right, All the dog bones are in, so now we'll go ahead and put the spider down. This holds all of those dog bones in place. The spider, just the fingers hold down over the top of the dog bones, and then you just put 3 bolts down in there, and that's it. Again, I'll put a picture over here maybe. It's an 11. It's an 11. It's a 1/2 inch bolt, 3 of them, that hold this spider down. Just go ahead. Don't torque them all the way down at first. Just kind of run them down evenly, you know. This is just a little thin sheet metal piece that holds the dog bones on. Once they're on, just click, good and tight. All right, and again, all right, kids, well, that's pretty much it. The only thing we really need to do now is put the oil pump on, put the oil pan on, timing cover, and that's it. But that's pretty much it for the short block build, basically. Short block, for those that you don't know, short block is basically camshaft, timing chain, lifters, pistons, the rotating assembly, which is the pistons, the crank and rods. That's what consists of a short block. When you tell people I have a long block, that's all of the short block plus the cylinder heads. I am ready to put the heads on, but I'm not going to do that in this video. I figured heads are pretty easy. I think you guys have done that before. I know you've seen me do it before. But that's it for the short block 360 5.9 Magnum. Again, welcome to Meats Rod Shop. I appreciate you watching this video and checking us out. You know, we've got quite a few different projects working on. So again, this is going to go into my 1971 Dodge Dart Swinger, which is behind me underneath the lift there. But I appreciate it. Remember, keep your heads up and keep your stick on the ice.